everybody. My name is Lian. I am an associate professor at the Department of Sports Science, Faculty of Applied Sciences, the Tunku Abdul Rahman University College in Kuala Lumpur. Today, my topic will be on deliberating the efficacy of periodization. Is periodization based on evidence? We'll start by examining a little bit on the historical origins of periodization. Periodization was supposedly used as early as during the ancient Olympics. Hans Sale, linked the general adaptation syndrome, or GAS, to how organisms respond physiologically to stress in a similar manner, resulting in similar responses. It was named periodization by Matveyev in 1965 and brought to the English-speaking world by former Eastern Bloc practitioners of this concept. Stone et al. Was among the earliest to propose a periodized model, and he named it the strength-power periodization model, and currently known as linear periodization. Now, how did periodization come to Malaysia? Many sports institutions currently utilize periodization when programming training for athletes. Periodization first surfaced in Malaysia in the early 1990s as Malaysia was given the opportunity to host the 1998 Commonwealth Games. Now, in order to host the Commonwealth Games more successfully, the Malaysian sporting institutions asked for help from experts from overseas, and we got help from the Canadian Coaching Association and a team of North American experts, including Dr. Tudor Bumper. So what is the definition of periodization? Bumper and Half in 2009 says that periodization divides training into smaller, more manageable parts or phases, and training phases targeted specific biomotor abilities or fitness components. And periodization achieves objectives for each phase, and this would lead to achievement of long-term objectives. Harris et al. In 2015 suggested that periodization is the systematic planning and structuring of training variables, which included intensity, volume, frequency, and rest, throughout designated training timeframes aimed at maximizing performance gains and minimizing the potential for overtraining or decrements in performance. The focus of today's discussion, we will be looking at how periodization has been investigated and written about in English for about 40 years, the many terms and concepts that are related to periodization, how it is still vague and ambiguous, and we'll be also examining a number of recent meta-analysis that has red flagged periodization as being more theoretical rather than evidence-based. So we will be re-examining periodization based on theory, research, and evidence. Now, firstly, we'll begin with the general adaptation syndrome as a central theory behind periodization. Bumper and Bazzicelli, in their newest edition of their famous text, noted that Sale discussed the gas theory and linked it to supercompensation. Russian, East German, and American researchers and authors have discussed this essential training concept. Gas is the basis of progressive overloading, but if this was applied inappropriately, it can create high degrees of undesirable stress. Now, Buckner et al. Did an actual documentation review in 2017 and found that Sale, who was being linked to the gas theory and training in sports, actually focused on stress responses from exposure to toxic levels of a variety of pharmacological agents, not sports. And he looked at acute responses mostly. The only more chronic response that he examined was for dosage of poisons on mice, which was carried out repeatedly. As such, the first question would be, the applications of gas to chronic resistance exercise may not actually be appropriate. And Sale himself has stated that he never considered the application of his research into sporting domains. And this was stated by Kylie in 2018. So the second aspect of gas came from a few diagrams that was in Bumper and Buzzicelli's book. We are looking at the acute responses of gas. Now, according to the theory of gas, a stimulus of stress, and in this case, sports training stimulus, induces negative physiological responses and fatigue, resulting in a drop of functional capacity and performance. However, this condition dissipates as any individual will try to return to homeostasis. So the figure on the right is the graph that has very popularly been used to denote supercompensation. Now, supercompensation, as we can see, which happens in phase 3, we actually, most experts denote supercompensation as as a situation when body dissipates fatigue and fully replaces the energy sources, allowing the body to rebound into a higher state of recovery known as supercompensation. And the entire phase, from the training stress through to compensation and supercompensation until the individual returns to homeostasis, over 4 phases, is suggested to take 1 to 7 days. Now, another figure suggested by Bumper and Buzzicelli used figure 1.9 on the left to explain processes involved which can be verified via previous research in exercise physiology. Most of the data here examine evidence as obtained through research in fatigue, EPOC, muscle force generation recovery, DOMS. Now, issues that need examination in phase 3 or supercompensation are, now, fatigue effects have dissipated, and Bumper and Buzzicelli have given numerous citations for each of the physiological processes. But does this mean that this individual, or the individuals involved in training, does this mean that the individual is in supercompensation or that he or she has just physiologically recovered? Because these are mostly physiological responses. And the evidence that was attached to the text have all given evidence that is related to exercise physiology. He did give a statement on psychological compensation though. So psychological compensation occurs, and during this phase is marked by high confidence levels, feelings of being energized, positive thinking, and ability to cope with frustrations and the stress of training. But there was no supporting citations given after this line. Gambetta, in another training book, Athletic Development, has used this figure to indicate that different types of training induced supercompensation at different rates. Lighter intensity training tend to induce supercompensation earlier, whereas higher and very tiring training tend to induce supercompensation after up to 72 hours. Now, from studies examining EPOC and fatigue, it seems credible that training at different intensities will produce different rates of recovery. However, based on this figure, issues that still need investigation and need empirical support. Is there actually scientific evidence to support that supercompensation occurs at the suggested time after such training? As stated earlier, a lot of the support is coming from empirical studies related to exercise physiology, especially to recovery from fatigue. But recovery to fatigue has not been linked directly to this concept called supercompensation. And the second area that needs examination is, do all athletes of all training backgrounds and status respond the same way to each type of training? Now, another issue that was brought up by Tudor Bumper and Buzzicelli was that they linked supercompensation with chronic training effects and adaptation. Now, when we plan training, it is suggested that planning of high, moderate, and low training intensities, training volumes, and bioenergetic specificity systematically and repeatedly is done in a sequence of microcycles or phases to allow for recovery between training sessions. Right? So basically the idea here is to have supercompensation performed repeatedly. But we need to be reminded that Sales gas theory was reported to be based on acute responses rather than chronic. Now, this figure suggests that if longer intervals were given between training sessions, such as the top figure, where 3 sessions of training were given a week, the athlete will experience less overall improvement. The lower figure shows shorter intervals between training sessions. This indicates that we have to alternate the training intensity of sessions to avoid consistently high training loads. But the lower figure indicates that there is a better level of performance improvement over many sessions of supercompensation. The next inconsistency that we can get from writings on periodization is related to the actual models of periodization. There have been inconsistent definitions for periodization models. Classical or linear tradition or traditional or strength power periodization. There are 4 terms that have been used, and what this model basically that defines is that there is a gradual increase in volume, intensity and work by phases within an annual training program. Reverse linear periodization has also been examined. Then there is undulating, the undulating model, but undulation for periodization could happen daily, weekly, or bi-weekly. There is this constant change in stimuli throughout training phases. The next type of periodized model is the block periodization model. This tends to be a newer model, but there seem to be many variations. Block training periodization models are defined by short periods, 1 to 4 weeks, that focuses on improving specific abilities while other abilities are maintained. And the final model, the accumulation, transmutation, and realization model. Now, these 4 models are the most consistently examined models in current literature. However, the most consistently used are linear and undulating models. The other models are not only inconsistently or wrongly used, there have been very ambiguous definitions given. Different authors seem to use different terminology. Now, when this happens within a field, in this case, within the field of periodization literature, miscommunication for definitions causes miscommunication within and across disciplines. Confusion when interpreting results. Now, we will now examine a few meta-analyses. The first meta-analysis that we will be talking about is a comparison of periodized and non-periodized resistance training on maximal strength. Now, this was written by Williams et al. In 2017. He found 18 studies published between 1988 and 2015, where maximal strength was measured by 1 repetition maximum squat, bench press, or leg press. The conclusion for this meta-analysis denoted that periodized resistance training plans have a moderate effect on 1RM compared to non-periodized training plans. So it seems to be that periodized protocols are better. But at the same time, his other conclusion was that variation due to this periodized model appears to be vital. The word there was vital for increasing maximal strength although the earlier statement was that it had a moderate effect. Now, how could a moderate effect then be denoted as vital? And he also concluded that longer periods of higher training frequency may be preferred. The next meta-analysis compared two periodized models, linear periodization and undulating periodization for strength. It was written by Harris et al. In 2015. And he utilized 17 studies. A total of 510 participants were included. 16 studies reported significant increases in strength for both models, for both periodization models. 5 studies reported significant differences between the two models. The conclusion is that there's no differences in the effectiveness of linear versus undulating periodization on upper body or lower body strength, and that there is no clear evidence favoring either linear or undulating periodization. However, he did state that there were possible confounding factors. In many of the research that was used, the training history was very poorly reported. It was not easily determined whether the training individuals were actually very trained or not very well trained, because determination of whether they were trained or untrained were not specifically reported. And we need to understand that untrained individuals tended to improve at a higher rate. And when you do not denote similar levels of whether an individual was trained and untrained, it was very difficult to compare. And some groups were found to be not similar at baseline. For example, there were studies where you have two groups that were formed without really denoting how they were actually formed, but we had two groups with one being very much stronger at baseline. And the next confounding factor was related to the training period. Short-term training periods were mostly used, between 9 to 12 weeks. Now, so longer-term interventions tend to give you better results, and they are needed to assess the actual effectiveness of both linear and undulating periodization. Because of this inability to diffuse these confounding factors, the question that arises here could be, is it actually volume of training that was the main influence rather than the variation between linear and undulating periodization? The next meta-analysis looked at traditional versus undulating periodization, and in the context of muscle strength and hypertrophy. Now, this was carried out by Caldas et al. In 2016. A total of 25 studies using 400 males and 192 females for durations of 6 to 16 weeks were utilized in this meta-analysis. 16 studies reported significant increases in strength for periodized approaches. 5 studies reported significant differences in improvements between groups. The conclusion is that the undulating periodized model seems better than the traditional model for improving maximum strength performance. There was no difference for improving power, muscular endurance, isometric strength, and muscle hypertrophy. Now, two similar meta-analyses. Why different conclusions? Now, meta-analysis depends on the quality of the studies upon which it is based. The original studies that were used for the meta-analysis could have poor design or bias. It could have been inaccurate in terms of the classification of the program, and the data summarized may not have been homogeneous. Another meta-analysis, or rather this was a review, looking at the periodization in team sport. A review of current knowledge and modern trends in competitive sport. Lian et al. In 2019 did an analysis of the bibliography methods of monitoring, training, and competition loads of the Polish national under-17 female soccer team in the seasons of 2011 and 12 and 2012 and 13, as well as the female basketball Division 1 club for the season of 2014 and 15. Now, this was an anecdotal account of reported training programs and loads. It was stated that this was a review of concentrated on types of training and competition workloads in macro, meso, and microcycles for elite athletes. Now, however, they did not explain how the athletes were deemed elite. And later on in the article, the reference was then to talented young athletes. They came to a conclusion that the preparatory phase should not be shorter than 8 to 12 weeks. The competitive phase should be 8 to 9 months and should be directed at gaining performance effectiveness. The transition phase, 8 to 12 weeks, should be directed at full physical and mental recovery. But where was the scientific evidence? All 49 references were not scientific literature. We also found many studies periodizing training for other variables and populations. The variables that were examined were for power, endurance, hypertrophy, body composition, speed, nutrition. And samples that have also been examined involved older adults, swimmers, inactive youth, and so on. Now, the studies that were performed in this last 15 years involving these variables and samples, they have just been performed accepting that periodization works and has scientific evidence. Now, the beginnings of questions to periodization was first published in 2012 by Kylie. Kylie stated that periodization theorists have devised and promoted training planning models based on interpretation of the scientific evidence and individual beliefs and experiences. But there were many loopholes in periodization. Kylie stated two, the first of which, the theory states that training variation is good. Repetition application of one unidirectional training stress is bad. But in training theory, we do need to note that if there is too much variation, adaptation for training becomes diluted. But that if there is too much repetitive application of unidirectional training stress, there is rapid improvement, but there is also monotony. So there is a need to balance variation and novelty to offset monotony, but there is also a need to acquire targeted fitness attributes. But the evidence to support the best model combining variation and focused training stress has been over-interpreted. Kylie continued with the second loophole that stated that periodization philosophy hinges on the presumption that biological adaptation to future training is predictable and follows a determinable pattern. Most training studies reported great variations in responses after periodized strength-focused interventions for both untrained and elite populations. So within both the untrained and elite populations, there are great variations. And for individuals will elicit a unique response for themselves. And this response is different to others, even though when they are training with identical training programs. So based on these two points, group-based patterns and observations could be highly misleading when generalized to individuals. So, two misconceptions in periodization literature. We are using a lot of average group-based trends to accurately reflect likely individual responses. And the second misconception is that the planning of methodologies of elite athletes. Now, elite athletes are outliers. And that this can be generalized and extrapolated to other elite individuals. So what is Kylie's suggestion for this? Kylie suggests that periodization template is useful, but results in a belief-based planning paradigm that is gradually becoming disconnected from contemporary science and elite practice, needs to be changed slightly. We need to analyze both periodization's success and failures. Historical prevalence and previous successful programs are not guaranteed future success. So he suggests that studies need to be based on data, and this data must be obtained via perceptive, validated measuring tools. And this might need to be done first. So research on validated measuring tools need to be performed, and they need to examine the variables quantifying training stress, such as pre-training readiness, in-training variables, and the assessment of accumulative stress. Now, another group of authors who questioned periodization was Alfonso et al. In 2017. He examined 42 empirical papers, out of which 24 were randomized trials and 18 were randomized controlled trials. He denoted that there was confusion because within these papers, there were concepts of periodization and variation, and these two terms were being used interchangeably. Also, predictions concerning the direction, timing, and magnitude of adaptations were not actually being tested. Analysis mostly focused on the physical aspects of performance, not on technical, tactical, or psychological factors. And the long-term empirical papers are minimal. Mostly were short-term. And there were confounding factors that were not examined, such as medication, nutrition, supplementation. They were not being properly reported and controlled. Data interpretation is being compromised by persistently ignoring inter-individual variation in responsiveness to experimental protocols. He seems to agree with Kylie on this. And Kylie did another paper in 2018 and stated that for over 70 years, periodization utilized the science of stress to substantiate certain fundamental periodization principles. However, stress science has diverged from its historical roots, but periodization theory still uses the same archaic stress interpretation as justification for contemporary planning of training. Now, there's growing evidence base related to the science of stress. We are now looking at non-physical, meaning psycho-emotional stress, influencing physical training adaptations. Stress responses are highly individualized and context-specific. But the periodization paradigm is still built on the implicit assumption that mechanical loading, that is physical stress, volume and intensity parameters are directly dictate biological training adaptations. So Kylie's conclusions: periodization proposes that adaptation to physical exercise follows a generically predictable trajectory. Biological training outcomes are directly mediated by physical training parameters, which are volume and intensity. The legacy of prior beliefs, sales gas theory, exerts a constraining influence on current practice. We need to be aware of the logical errors, the oversights, and the misconceptions implicit in periodization's philosophical underpinnings. Contemporary evidence illustrates that there are no generalized formulaic solutions to these planning puzzles. We need to change as evidence demonstrating the impact of acute emotional influence on training outcomes multiplies. There is another review, and this group of writers, Cunanan et al., in 2018, are clearly proponents of periodization. In the review, this group defended GAS as an appropriate mechanistic model to conceptualize the periodization of training. Differentiates periodization with programming, with periodization being the macro management of training process with respect to time. But programming is the micromanagement of variables of training, such as density of training load, volume, intensity of training, exercise selection, and order, sets, and repetitions, etc. So there is a difference. So periodization does not mean the micromanagement of training variables. Now, they also denoted that excessive accumulative fatigue inhibits physiological adaptations to training, produces non-beneficial psychological effects, increases injury, illness, and overtraining potential. And that Sale envisaged broad applications of the gas theory and called on other innovative thinkers to develop and apply it within their respective fields, meaning that they did not expect gas to remain as is. So Sale continued to clarify about the gas and its related concepts and modified it according to scientific changes to stress and adaptation. And that current review recognized that gas does not account for all reactions or processes related to stress, and that there have been notable reviews that related gas directly to biological and physiological responses and adaptations to exercise. And also, many theorists have detailed the conceptual application of gas to training. Gas has been noted here to be proven to be an instructive framework for understanding the mechanistic process of providing a training stimulus to induce specific adaptations that result in functional enhancements. Additional research is necessary to further elucidate the precise application of the gas model to sports training, as well as to refine the practices of periodization and programming. So after all the previous discussions, I will now do a summary of the theoretical and evidence inadequacies, because there seems to be more and more evidence denoting that periodization studies need to be improved on. So let's start by saying that gas was originally used to focus on acute stress responses from exposure to toxic levels of pharmacological agents. Therefore, the use of gas to chronic resistance exercise may not be appropriate. Actual document analysis suggests that Sale never considered the application of his research to sporting domains but to toxins. So is the transfer of use acceptable? Most evidence to support supercompensation by proponents of periodization linked supercompensation to physiological processes such as fatigue, epoch, DOMS, etc. But does this mean the individual is in supercompensation, or are they actually recovered from a fatigue state? Other than physical training, empirical research for other factors, technical, tactical, and psychological factors, are minimal. Bumper and Buzzicelli define psychological supercompensation as when an individual has high confidence, feelings of being energized, positive thinking, and an ability to cope with frustrations and the stress of training, but no supporting citations were given. From studies examining epoch and fatigue, it seems credible that training at different intensities will produce different rates of recovery. Issues that still need investigation. Is there actual scientific evidence to support that supercompensation occurs at the suggested time after such training? Do athletes of different training status respond the same way to each type of training? Then there is the linking of supercompensation with chronic training effects, when the effects of Sale's gas was actually reported to be based on acute responses. And then there is the inconsistent definitions for periodization models. Now this causes miscommunication within and across disciplines, and there is also confusion when interpreting results. There are actually very few well-designed studies. Because there seem to be similar overall, do they actually look at similar overall experimental training loads? There were studies actually comparing periodization models with different end volumes at the overall training loads towards the end of the periodization experiment. Then did they compare similar training backgrounds? Were the samples actually similar? Were they homogeneous? Now, were they using untrained or trained groups? The definition of trained and untrained was very confusing because there were studies that denoted trained subjects with strength indices of approximating only 1.5, whereas there were studies that had strength-trained subjects with strength indices that were well over 2. So using trained or untrained groups were not well defined. Now, when you want well-designed studies, you also have to try to look at consistency of training phases. There were different amounts of time used. Training phases were 2, 3, or 4 weeks. And there were total duration of training that ranged from 6 to 24 weeks. And we need studies, well-designed studies that will use longer-term interventions in order to assess the actual effectiveness of the variation of training loads. Most of these studies that were examined made poor attempts at controlling all variables except the one thing being tested. They just call it a periodized model. So for a well-designed study, we need to make a good attempt. There must be control of everything from training loads to having homogeneous background to defining what are they really trained subjects, right? To actually trying to have more studies to determine what phases are actually suitable to be used. And of course, the final one, longer-term intervention. We need to control everything so that they become well-designed studies. Results indicating that one periodized model is better. The periodized model that was termed better actually had higher training loads. So it seems to be there were many studies. Those studies that controlled training loads found that there was no difference between training the periodized models. The next confusion that we actually had was actually what is the meaning of training load? A training load should be repetitions multiplied by the load multiplied by sets. A few researchers had actually determined that training load was actually repetitions times sets. So this created further confusion and evidence inadequacy. And finally, reviews were made on books, periodicals, anecdotal accounts of reported training programs and loads. We need more substantiating well-designed research. We need substantiating articles that are scientific research. So we also had different conclusions from meta-analysis. Why did it happen? Meta-analysis depended on the quality of the studies upon which they are based. Original studies could have poor design or bias, inaccurate classification of programs, and the data summarized may not be homogeneous. And finally, a few research had very poorly reported statistics. The standard deviations were so small, leading to very large effect sizes, and this cannot be credible. So the conclusion is, in order to improve periodization scientific credibility, there's still a lot to be done. There's a lot more credible evidence needed to be obtained via well-designed research over longer training periods. We need the use of very well-trained subjects. How is it that none of the studies actually use very well-trained Olympic lifters? Then we need clarification and standardization of definitions so that the research has no more miscommunication between researchers of different fields. So with that, I would like to end my presentation for today. Thank you very much.